Good evening, everyone. Thank you. I'll just say something about African joining CARICOM, and I welcome that. Because as far as the Pan-African movement has been engaging with the question, I actually wanted to remind people that that Pan-African movement that dates back from the 18th century, 19th century, early 20th century, has been talking about the question of reparation, restorative justice in various forms. So it's not new, and it's known as the African diaspora has always been communicating. Remember Marcus Garvey and many others. So I really want to acknowledge that. The question of reparation is also often equated to the question of compensation, and quite rightly so, because we have the Act of 1837, that is the Compensation Act that Jack mentioned earlier. And it's really, at the time, it was more to do with compensation, monetary compensation. And therefore, the idea of reparation speaks to me as somebody who's working in humanities, because it's to do with more than money. It's to do with something that is deeper, that speaks to us in terms of the ethics, the moral, the cultural, social, everything. So it's deeper, and it's to do with repairing the damage caused. Also knowing that those damages could never really be fully repaired. We know that. So it's about the conversation and dialogue that needs to continue for centuries to come. I just wanted to say that if we talk about reparation, etc., there are many examples. I talked about the Pan-African, but we can go back to as far as Africa, but it's my very first class that I teach, and I'm not going to do that because it's a 2 hours class, but just to say that the question of compensation, reparation, you already have it with the Kingdom of Congo and the Portuguese, taking people who have been, who have, you know, the subject of that kingdom, and then branding them and claiming them for themselves. And the kings and the King of Congo, one of them, contesting that. So, you know, it's a long history. Other examples, just 1778, after slavery was outlawed in the state of Vermont, Pompey Brachy, an enslaved man who sued his master. He was still enslaved, and he sued his master for refusing to free him. It's not just about freedom, it's about the compensation, the idea that you free me, but you need to give me the means to survive after having freed me. So it's a form of reparation and compensation. 1783, another one, state of Massachusetts ordered that former enslaved called Belinda Royale be paid a pension and the proceedings of her former master because of the in acknowledgement of her unpaid labor. She was a free woman. She wanted to be compensated for her work. Not just back payment, but everything that she endured. People being animated in the Caribbean, still working for their former masters after abolition. They demanded land, they demanded compensation. They did not have access to that land. And in fact, the question of land is crucial in that discussion about reparation. And I wanted to give you the example of, well, should I say my country? Yeah, I'm going to say that. Okay, I'm French. Forgive me. And I looked at New Caledonia, a French territory colonized by the French, and the indigenous population known as the Kanak demanded that their land be returned to them by former colonizers and by France. So there was a conversation that took place. So in the 1990s, the land law reform that they pushed really forward allowed them to reclaim that. So 9% of the land was given to indigenous population. That's 167,000 hectares. It's nothing. It's only 9%, but that can be seen as compensation or reparation. 2017, after the riots and strikes, the government at the time promised to return 400,000 hectares to the indigenous population of Guyana, French Guyana. Well, they didn't. It's an ongoing discussions. change of governments, delaying tactics, and so on. But through land reform, there's the idea of compensation and reparation that has been fought by people there. What is interesting is that Christian Taubira, who was, one of the initiators of this idea that France acknowledged slavery as a crime against humanity, off the record, but it's an open secret. One of the reasons why Parliament almost unanimously accepted that, France should recognize that is only the back discussions was if she removed the idea of reparation from that, and she had to capitulate. So, there are things that have been happening, and when you talk about reparation, it's compromise, it's fight, and what you always see is not necessarily what took place. And Christian Taubira was very adamant about this question of land for the indigenous population. What I wanted to say is that in Europe, we've seen that. You mentioned several institutions, University of Glasgow, in the America, Brown. Brown for me was, a good example. 2003, the descendants and students pushed for changes and for the idea of reparation, of restorative justice rather than a big chunk of money. But it didn't go further. It didn't go enough far than what they wanted, because some of the descendants have been sold. Some of the ancestors have been sold to either support the university or to fund the university. Some of the funders had enslaved people. So it was very close. It's a different kind of thing that happened in the Caribbean. So Harvard pledged $100 million for reparation. We have other universities trying to do something. I'm not going to mention, yes, I will. My former university, University of Bristol, not talking about them, but I talk about University of Cambridge that decided to do this, not as a college by college initially, but through central system. And they did an interesting work. I was part of the advisory board, and there was some tension. That could be a whole 2 hours discussion over tensions. So I'm not going to go there, but what I wanted to say is that universities, institutions, Green King, for example, Church of England, the Bank of England, and 3 days ago, Lloyd's spoke about all these things. So some things are happening at institutional level. And because they are I don't know if it is because they are happening at institutional level, but it's a very different model for the UK. So institutions are taking upon themselves to kind of try and deal with this question. We know that it's also about controlling the narrative. So, the agenda there, the politics of reparations are there that we really need to be careful in to understand. It doesn't mean that it's always a bad thing or a good thing. I'm not thinking in those terms. I'm thinking in terms of who gets to set the agenda, what amount, who gets to decide of the amount, how it's done. Is there any consultation? So one of the things that I have been involved, more recently are the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust a few years ago got in touch with me because they did the research, an interesting, rigorous research, because the trust has been set up by people who are involved in colonialism, and they acknowledged the pain, they apologized, etc. They were grappling with something, which was that they needed more research to be done, but they were also afraid to commission more research because they were saying that how can we be impartial if we commission but we pay the people? How can we distance ourselves from these things? So what they asked me to do is to think about what they could potentially take. And I advise them at my level, which was for me the basis of everything, is consultation. There are a vast number of grassroots organizations that have been working on the question for such a long time that we can't, in this day and age, just ask an academic to set up a whole agenda. So I think they're in the process of doing things that will come to fruition. And one of the things that I really like about that is that they didn't set a date, an end date. It's an ongoing conversation. They didn't set a number in terms of how much. The number would not be determined, that's what they said at the time, by themselves. It should be determined by the people they're consulting with. More recently, Joseph is here, Joseph Harker, who is working for The Guardian, who is leading, I'm not going to say all your titles, but who has been leading on the research about The Guardian. So the research was done by very good researchers and academics. And my role in this was basically to have a critical gaze and analyze the research and see where the gaps were. And one of the things that's really was important for me is the fact that as an academic, I work with sources that are Europeans, archives, and all these stuff. It's the gaze, it's the European gaze on the population. So how do we make voices from the descendants or voices from the ancestors emerge from these archives? Sometimes we can't. And we are in the danger of actually putting the slaveholders on a pedestal because we're studying their families, their history, them. And that was one of the problems that I had with the research. But what The Guardian decided to do is to actually put the descendant at the center of any other discussion. And I really, really welcome that. I'm holding them into account. And I really welcome that. So it's an ongoing discussion. They've gone several times to Jamaica. Joseph could say more than me about this. But what is important for me is constantly to have accountability and to monitor. And I'm not too close to them to tell them how it is. So I think that one of the last point I would like to make about this project with Guardian is that the only problem that I have is the fact that there's no connection or stronger connection between what is being done that is fantastic, which is they're going to consult, they're going to look at this 10-year plan, they're going to, it's happening. They're going to involve grassroots, they're going to involve people there to design the restorative justice. They're not going to do it on their own. But the problem I have is still that I still see our young people struggling with this, not being involved in this conversation because they don't feel that it's theirs, it's about them. Police brutality, the Windrush, and all these stuff are not necessarily taken into account when we talk about reparation. It's as if these are separate things, and I feel the disconnect because, well, I live in Wales and I keep saying that, but I live in one of the most deprived areas. I've been living for 20 years, and when you talk about reparation, they look at you and they don't care because it's poverty, exclusion, and marginalization. So how do we bring them into this conversation, and how does this amount of initiative actually affect them is what really is important to me. Thank you.